Hi, my name is Andrew Delaney. For this Businessperson presentation, I wanted to look at the life of Bernard Madoff, and all the information that I gathered is from an article by Will Kenton. So what we're going to do is just look at his life, what he did, kind of how he fell into the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, and then some of the potential factors that contributed to what he did. So here's a little bit of background on Madoff. He was an investment advisor born in 1938. At the age of 22, he started his own business trading penny stocks worth about $5,000. Considering inflation, they're worth about $40,000 at the time. And despite his skill and talent for the trade, he's now known as the man behind the largest Ponzi scheme in history, stealing about $64.8 billion in client assets. So Madoff claimed to generate large and consistent returns on investment using a split strike conversion strategy. Basically what this did is it basically reduced risk, but also reduced rewards. And even though he claimed to be getting these types of returns from this investment strategy, he wasn't using this strategy at all. All he was doing is he was using his natural charisma to woo clients to invest with him. And instead of investing that money elsewhere, he just put it into a bank account and he spent as he wished and kept some behind. So when those investors came back to him for returns on his investments, he would pay them back with some of the money that he had, but with the return, he would have to go to new clients. He would take the money that the new clients gave him to pay off previous investors, and so on. When the new investors wanted their returns, he would find even more clients to take their money from. This actually worked for a while. About 50% of his clients actually got a return on their investments, which is crazy considering the entire time he wasn't actually investing. He was just using his charisma to take money from other people to pay other people off. But his luck did run out. In 2008, when the market crashed, no one was really in a place to invest anymore, and all of his investors came calling to receive returns on the investments. In 2008, his scheme was up. So on December 10th in 2008, Madoff confessed to his scheme to his sons Mark and Andy. His sons turned him into a lawyer, and Madoff was sentenced to prison for 150 years and was forced to forfeit $170 billion. Several of his colleagues were also sent to prison, and after the fact research showed that this scheme began all the way back in the 1960s. This was a scam that lasted for 5 decades. Over 65,000 petitions were filed by victims of this scheme in over 136 countries. 35,000, or a little bit over 35,000 of those petitions have been approved to receive payment from the Madoff Victim Fund. So the big question is, this huge Ponzi scheme over all these decades, all these people affected, why did it happen? How did it happen? How did Bernard Madoff start with just a really talented guy in the trade and get to become the guy who's behind the greatest Ponzi scheme in history? Well, to look into that, what I want to do is just look over a number of the good people, bad actions discussions that we've done over the first 8 weeks of the course and try to decide if the topics and discussions from those weeks had anything to do with his actions. From the video content in week 1, here was the most interesting quote that I found. I would never do that. I could never end up there. I'm not even capable of doing that. Here's the way I like to think about it. Good and bad actions, it's kind of like you plant a seed. It's like you're planting a seed of a good action or a bad action. At the beginning, it doesn't look like there's much going on, but those seeds begin to grow. And once they begin to grow, they can reveal really what those seeds were like. So small things in the beginning can eventually lead to much bigger things later. We're all capable of good and bad things. It really determines what seeds are we planting into the ground. So Madoff, at the beginning of his career, he behaved ethically and he was planting good seeds, but it may have started with one thing that he said. He felt like he was outside of the Wall Street crowd. And maybe it was just a small thing like wanting to be on that in crowd that he decided to plant just one bad seed, tell just one lie, just skew a couple numbers just to become in that crowd. And it could have been as simple as planting one bad seed that eventually grew and grew and grew until it was out of control. In week 2, we talked about conformity bias. Conformity bias is the tendency to take cues of ethical behavior from our peers, people around us, instead of looking inwardly to find these cues. I see this all the time working with kids. I see one child decide to behave one way, and the person sitting right next to him, just looking at the way that this child was behaving, follows suit. And this kid's behavior becomes this kid's behavior because this child was following into conformity bias, and he chose that. Maddox said something really interesting. He said this: I just allowed myself to be talked into something, and that's my fault. He wasn't clear about who he talked to in the beginning, or who they even was, or what they may have said, but in a way, conformity bias played a big role into this whole scheme. He allowed someone else to determine his own ethical values. The video in week 3 stuck out to me in one way. It was really interesting. The quote was this: we all want to behave ethically, but we also want to please authority figures. Now this stuck out to me with Madoff's story because he said this. He said that his father failed as a businessman, but that he would not fail as a businessman. Maybe some of these desires to succeed, they were at one time a healthy place, but his ultimate desire to please authority, to please his father, it caused him to eventually behave unethically when an ethical approach wasn't enough to have the success that he so wanted so that he could please the authority figures. In week 5, we talked about self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is one of the most relatable topics to me in this entire class. I see this most obviously when I look back at my career officiating basketball and baseball. Sometimes as the official, you feel like no one likes you, and it's kind of true. There have been times where I'll make a call and half the fans cannot believe that I made the call. And the other half are like, yeah, it's completely the right call. Why? Are they seeing 2 different games? No. They're just both answering to self-serving bias. People can see what they want to see, and because they see what they want to see, there's that bias. Madoff could have been a victim of this. He decided, well, behaving unethically, it begins to serve me in this case, and so I'm willing to look past my ethical behavior in order to have what I want. I love the conversation we talked about in week 8. Week 8 gave a really interesting fact. It said this: 92% of Americans are satisfied with their moral character. 92%. Now I got to thinking, if we were to ask all Americans if 92% of Americans have good moral character, I don't think every individual would say yes. I think they would say, well, yeah, maybe mine is good, but 92% of Americans? I don't think so. There's no way that each individual would say that the large majority of Americans have good moral character. Why? It's because each individual is determining their own moral character and their own ethical behavior. So if I'm with someone who believes the same way with me politically and ethically, then we're more likely to say, yeah, I think we have good moral character. But someone who believes differently, I might say, no, that person does not have good moral character. So this comes down to the question that is brought up almost every single week in this class. Who gets to determine what is right, what is wrong? What is good, and what is evil? Who gets to determine that? Does politics? Does culture? Does each individual for themselves? I won't get into that, but the question that really need to get to here is, what would Madoff have said about his moral character? Would he have sided with 92% of Americans and said, yeah, I have good moral character? Or would he have been the 8% that said, despite what I'm doing, I don't think this is right? So what can we learn from all of this? Well, we can look at what should he have avoided. He should have avoided the very first unethical act. This is where incrementalism comes into play. One small thing and it just builds and builds and builds and builds. Here's the other thing he could have done. He should have taken the first out that he had. When things come and we're maybe have an idea to behave unethically, we're all given another option. We're all given a choice to choose one way or the other. We all have that option, a way out, a way of escape. Take the first out and don't behave unethically.